But here's the agenda for today. We're going to go through the general overview of the non-PO voucher workflow, get into what the workflow is and how it affects our general ledger, just kind of go through a mock adding an actual non-PO voucher, look into vendor document number and memo fields, and if we have time at the end, we'll look at the purchasing transaction detail report, but more specifically for looking at non-PO voucher transactions. And of course, those concepts can be used for any of our purchasing transaction types. In the bottom of the screen, you should have a menu for a chat box. So as we go, anytime you have a question, please use the chat box to ask the question. I'll monitor that and answer the questions as we go. So when it concerns general ledger activity, a non-PO voucher does not have any effect on our encumbrances. So unlike many of the other workflows, non-PO vouchers are payment requests and they strictly affect the expense and accounts payable general ledger activity. So using a non-PO voucher will not release any encumbrance and it's not going to create any encumbrance. The general ledger is not affected by any of the non-PO voucher activity until it's approved. So just submitting or having one partially approved has no effect. And that includes our budgets, which are not affected until the request is fully approved. And basically what that tells us is if I had a $100 budget, I could submit 100 $100 requests. And it isn't until one of those are approved before the rest of those are affected. And then at that point, any approval of those 99 other requests will get an error message to the person approving and they'll have to be declined, like we see sometimes when we try to submit a document that's over budget. So in this kind of busy table, this covers 4 steps about a non-PO voucher. Step 1 is a user is going to submit a non-PO voucher. The state of that document would say submitted, and the last 2 columns tell us whether or not there would be a general ledger entry, and if there's none. Once a person submits a non-PO voucher, the first person to review this is the program approver, which is typically the program director or whoever's been designated to approve in that person's role. They can do one of 2 things, decline or approve. And no matter what action they take, there's no effect on our general ledger at that point. Declining returns it back to the original person. They get the message that it's been declined and now they can make any correction they need to if they need to resubmit. The approval of the program approver sends this to our program monitor who has the same 2 choices. Decline it or approve it. And regardless of the monitor's action, there is no effect on the general ledger still yet at this point. And then it's the final person, the finance manager, who can make one of the same 2 choices, which is to decline or to approve the document. The approval of the finance manager would result in your expense being debited and accounts payable being credited. And then the document is then created as a bill in accounts payable so that accounts payable can do what they have to do to get the treasurer's approval and print a check. But as we can see, it's not until all 3 approvers have approved that our budgets are affected or our general ledger is affected. Concerning non-PO vouchers, there's basically 5 states that we'll see. Draft if the user has saved it as a draft. Partially approved if the program approver has approved and the monitor may have approved and finance manager hasn't approved. Basically, as long as the first person has approved the document, it would say partially approved. Submitted if none of the people had approved yet, it's pending approval of the first person, the program approver. Declined if any of the people had declined the document, it would say declined. And lastly, we would see closed, and this would mean all 4 individuals involved. The person submitted it and the 3 people who approved it. All of that has happened. And the document is now either sitting with accounts payable or depending on the timing of it, it could have already gone through accounts payable and got a check printed. So when does a purchasing transaction impact the general ledger? When all approvers in the workflow have approved, never at any time before. This means that budget availability is not affected until after a document is approved. So we got to watch out for multiple submissions we think may be within budget because they passed that initial thing that allows us to submit. And as I said at the beginning, in totality, all of our requests may affect the budget or go over the budget, but it isn't until they start getting approved that it's impacted. So in the middle of all this, we might have things approved, and then afterwards, the rest of the pending stuff can't be approved. So occasionally, I'm sure the program monitors get these kind of questions, but I'll get a question of why would they approve this request and not this one? And it has nothing to do with the choice. It has to do with when they were approved and the fact that we can submit as many requests as we want and budget isn't affected until something gets approved. Non-PO vouchers have no effect on encumbrances at any point. After submitting our purchasing request and getting approval, we should be checking our financial reports, checking purchasing reports, checking them again to make sure that we know if we've submitted requests, is there anything I should anticipate that's pending approval that might be affected by that, so I can get ahead of any potential declines because of no budget being available. Or if I'm going to prepare a new request, at least I would know what the budget's going to be. In the last 2 years, I took a look at non-PO vouchers. These are the most common uses for non-PO vouchers, basically in totality by dollar amount. Mileage, medical travel checks, protective payee requests, donations, WIC vouchers, community payments, child care provider payments, general assistance, energy assistance, subrecipient pass-through requests, and insurance. So in other words, we're not paying our normal utilities, office supplies, capital equipment purchase. Any of those things typically aren't going through the non-PO voucher. So this is going to be stuff that typically doesn't require approval in advance. Like mileage, like medical travel. Those are the kinds of things that happen as they're ongoing. So it's these types of activity we'd be referencing as we talk about non-PO vouchers. We've already kind of gone through this workflow, but here it is again. The program user is the first person that's going to be involved in any non-PO voucher request. They can do two things: create a non-PO voucher and submit one. So any of the actions they take would create a status or a document state of draft, submitted, or declined. Program director can review to approve or decline. When it's at their level, it's going to say submitted. Program monitor, when it's at their level, it'll say partially approved. They can approve or decline. And the finance manager, they can approve or decline, and it'll say one of two things: partially approved if they haven't approved yet, or closed if once their approval is received. At no point can someone who approves one of these requests actually make a change to the document itself. So if there was a mistake on dollar amount, the vendor document number, something like that needs to be updated, the program monitor, the program director, the finance manager have no ability to make that change. It has to be declined so the document can be edited, which might be inconvenient if it's at the end. It's at Lynette's the person reviewing, and now she can't approve the document. But these are things that we have to take into consideration before submitting a request. And this is important to know because we have to utilize certain fields, and failure to use them correctly can cause delays. Probably the biggest one that we see in the non-PO voucher is the vendor document number. These have to be unique for each vendor. And so if we happen to use one that repeats from a prior submission, you may not see the error as the program user, and the monitor will not see the error, and neither does the program approver. But who sees the error is the finance manager. And so when that person tries to approve the request, Intacct then verifies that vendor document number to see if it's been used before, because now it's trying to post to the general ledger. So if she has that error, there's nothing more she can do. She can't make that change. It has to be declined and everything starts over. We're using the class dimension now. So if it reaches Lynette and class is required, she can't add that either. So that would have to result in the request being declined and returned. Budget is verified when a user submits a purchasing transaction. So you can take the things into effect. Does the line item for your funding source have the funds available to accommodate that request or multiple requests if you're submitting more than one? Upon submission, budget's not affected. Budget's affected when the request is fully approved. And important to understand, because you can submit multiple requests that meet existing budget, but in totality exceed your total available balance. So let's get into creating a non-PO voucher and actually into Intacct. As with any purchasing request, we use the application menu at the top. We find purchasing. Non-PO vouchers are located at invoice, and we can add them one of two ways. Either clicking the plus sign to go directly to adding a document, or clicking on non-PO voucher to go to the list of transactions you might have access to for your program. I created a custom view here just so it would land on a specific one I've done in the past. And since some of the stuff here is sensitive with the donations and stuff. But you would see something similar to this if you went by list view. And at that point, you can see the ones you've done, items that are pending, things that have been declined. So you can address those, or you can click the add button on the top right to begin adding a new non-PO voucher. You can use any of these columns and the space below to search. So if you wanted to find specific transactions that have happened in the past, you can certainly search by vendor or other information available. In the left screen, there's an option for different types of views that you would have available to you, or you can use all just to see everything. And so I created a one for today just called No PO Training View. That's we can see now. And so in this column, I added dollar amount. We have the state here. Who created the request? So this one's for me. The vendor and the payment status. So this is a document from 4 years ago when we had a little bit different workflow of non-PO voucher. So this doesn't tag to any check transaction as they do today. So we'll go ahead and add a new non-PO voucher. And one of the things we want to take into consideration is our cursor actually starts in the date field, which is important to know because if it starts here in this date field and we start typing, thinking that we're typing a vendor, this can affect the date on the transaction. So if I typed an R, for example, it immediately changes the date to 12/31, the end of the year. And if I don't notice that, I just realize, hey, it didn't start searching for a vendor. Now I can start typing vendor names or whatever. If I don't pay attention to this, there's a possibility I get this transaction posted into an incorrect fiscal year, which happens occasionally. We've posted stuff into the future. When I was preparing this training slides, I noticed yesterday we actually had stuff posted back to 2008. So we got to be very careful with the dates. And because there's keys here that affect that stuff, we need to be careful. In our help guide for Intacct, if I go to the Help Center, I type the word shortcut. One of those searches is results is keyboard shortcuts. And so it gives us shortcuts on records and transactions, line item entries, drop-down fields, and then date fields. So R returns the last day of the year, and some of the other letters that can do that. So someone might incorrectly date one and then want to say, I didn't choose that date. Well, you didn't, but one of those keys can easily do that. One I like to use is T for today's date. So if I go back up to here, click a T, I'm already back to 4/9 without having to have typed all the letters for it. So pretty handy. So now that we got today's date in there, now we're looking for a vendor. All our vendors, when we type, read left to right. So if we were looking for me, for example, and I didn't realize that, and I started typing LJ, nothing's going to come up. Or Lewis, it's going to be a completely different vendor, one that actually has Lewis going from left to right. So that needs to be kept in mind when searching. Most people's names, as we can see here, go last name, then first name. So if we're looking for vendors like that, if we're doing a donation, medical, travel, we need to be searching for our vendors that way. If we're not sure, we can always click to find a vendor and then do a search differently. So if we couldn't find me, certainly that's not going to work going that way. We could type find or click on find, and it takes us to a list of all the vendors. Nothing comes up for LJ still. So if we use the percentage sign, which is a wildcard, I type LJ now and then click enter. Anything that has the combination LJ in the name is going to come up. So we have LJ Moran and KLJ Engineering. So if we're looking for vendors, okay, now I found the person or the company I'm looking for, since I wasn't sure of what it was from left to right, since Intacct is very specific that way. And then we can choose our vendor and move forward. In other words, if we can't find a vendor, let's take this next step. And then if we still can't find a vendor from that point, now is maybe the time we would request a new vendor before we can move forward with our transaction. The vendor I'm going to use today is test. So if I keep the percentage sign in there for the wildcard and type test, any vendor with the name test in it is going to show up, no matter where in the name the word test appears. So we can see American Engineering Testing, Ready to Test, National Test System, Battle Tested. So it doesn't have to match exactly the word test as long as the combination of the word test appears in a vendor name. And so it just so happens testing vendor is available and ready to select, so I don't need to request a new vendor today. Payment terms and expiration date are typically driven by the date we use. Non-PO voucher defaults to 30 days. So payment terms already put in there 30 and expiration date of 5/9, 30 days from today. Ultimately, these fields are inconsequential to anything that we do within Intacct. So it's a required field to be used for us. So just in case it's blank before you're processing, make sure there's something in the expiration date. Message is an internal communication that we can use for people who are reviewing the document. Payment priority, you can change this from normal, low, high to urgent. Big picture, that affects absolutely nothing in the approvals. It doesn't move yours ahead of anybody's. It's just a column that has those as options. If we had an actual emergency that we're trying to do, we would use the emergency workflow. And then we have fiscal year end, of which we could choose the current year, or if this were an FY22 in this document was a request that needed to be accrued to FY21, we could choose prior. Now, vendor document number, though, is a field that cannot be duplicated from other times testing vendor was used in the system. It's set to give an error that doesn't allow the transaction to create a bill. And like I said earlier, that error will only be seen by Lynette and not by the user, which can be frustrating because that's any time the vendor was used, not just when you used it. So we need to make sure it's as unique as possible. The vendor document number field can be up to 30 characters. And so, it's unlikely we'd be paying a bill through non-PO voucher. We've seen the most common types of transactions, so we might not have a unique bill to refer to. So maybe we would use the vendor name and today's date. Then the next time you use them would likely not be today. It'd be the next time, whatever date in the future. So we can use something like this. If we have attachments to send, we can add attachments basically two ways. This field's blank, so we don't have a current attachment. You can hit the drop-down box and click Add to create a new attachment folder. And I'm going to minimize the screen a little bit here. You can also drag a document from your desktop and drop it onto the screen. So if this Excel shortcut document I have on my desktop was the supporting documentation, I can bring it in here and drop it. It doesn't matter where on screen I drop it. Intacct will process that now as an attachment, and it's now attached. This is probably the easiest way to add attachments. If I had another attachment, like this Intacct credit card PowerPoint presentation I have, I can just bring it on screen, drop it, and it goes through the deal. When it's done, you get a little message up here that it's done, appended a new file. If we click the paperclip to view the attachments, we can see those two things that I dropped here. So drag and drop, very handy. And for those of us, if you're not aware, you haven't had a chance to see this or experience this, about 6 months ago, Intacct made a change to our attachments folder for people with the user type called employee, which is most of the users. Like if you work for a program, you have an employee user account. We don't see this in finance with our accounts, but if I were an employee user and I realized my Excel with Wayne 200 shortcut guide document actually wasn't a good supporting document for this and I have to get rid of it, if I click to edit and I'm a program user, I don't have the trash can. So you wouldn't be able to get rid of this document from your attachments. So if you needed to make adjustments to your attachments, you could click into this attachment field, highlight what's there, and just backspace it, and then we can start a whole new attachment. And then leave off my Excel with Wayne shortcut guide, or whatever document it is that we're looking for. And that's for anywhere attachments are managed, any of the other purchasing workflows. But drag and drop is a handy dandy way to have our attachments. And especially not uncommon, but if we're using the drop-down folder to manage our attachments, let me maximize this again. We have these two things. Are we going to add attachment or are we going to view attachments? Common sense would tell us if I'm going to add to this folder, I'm going to click add. So I click add, my files in the attachment are empty. And so if I went ahead and browsed, found another attachment on my desktop that I wanted to include, and click save, and now if we go to view these attachments, only that one remains. So we got to be very careful managing the attachments through here. If we want to make adjustments or add new stuff, we don't start by clicking add, we start by clicking view. And then I can edit the folder and find other attachments I need to include. So if we have circumstances in purchasing where the monitor is declining something because a receipt is missing, an invoice is missing, whatever document they're looking to see is gone, and we know we've added that, this is likely the source of the conflict on what's happening with your attachments. So be careful with that. In all circumstances, just use drag and drop, and you won't have to deal with clicking add to add, but that actually deletes your attachments first. So hopefully that makes sense there. If you have questions, please use the chat box. So now we can go to line entries. And there's a couple things I want to show with line entries if you haven't used them before, like this show defaults. If this is going to be an entry that has multiple lines, we want to cut out some time typing some stuff. If I go into show defaults, find my funding source. First, if I pick funding source, it's automatically going to add the program and checkbook for me. So 2 more entries I had to cut down on making by going to the funding source first. And if I click apply defaults, it's already going to fill in program, funding source, and checkbook for me. And then I cheated on my test funding source. I went and added this class as regular, so it'll always fill in regular, so I don't have to add that anytime I do these trainings and forget about it. And then now all we have to do is enter our line item. I just have the one line item to use, so obviously we probably wouldn't be using office supplies in this case. But we're going to be using one of the things that's appropriate, like mileage or donations, medical, travel, that kind of stuff. We have the memo field we can use for communication. And something to think about in the memo field, let me hide this little area here. Whatever we put in the vendor document number, whatever we put on this memo field shows up on a check stub. So make sure whatever we put there is also valuable to the company that's going to get the check from you. So we'd have whatever communication we're putting here to end up on the check. And then now we can work on our quantity field and our price. So we got the price of $1. If I'm done at this point, I have my attachments, I have my vendor document number, I've got the fiscal year end field entered. I could click submit and move on to the program director. We do have a show spend insight button that we can use, and it would tell us what the current budget is, what has actually been expensed against this line item, if there's any open POs against the line item, and then how much this request is worth and how much funds would be available when I'm done. So just clicking spend insight, I would know if I had a second request coming, I still got $99 I can use for my next request. If my request happened to be for $100, I would know I need to be on top of this because my next request isn't going to, my next request wouldn't get approved if this was $100. And I can get ahead of that now and do a budget mod or make any adjustments I have to make sure these purchases go through. So we have memo field suggestion like account number with vendor invoice number. Those are great things to use, especially like on your vouchers, on the other payment, your justifications. And in this one, we're doing mileage, medical, travel, burial assistance, all those types of things that get used in non-PO voucher, general assistance. So that one you might have the month and that kind of information in there that's useful. If there's an account number or invoice number that belongs here, then certainly put that there because that ends up on the check number, on the check stub. So now at this point, we've got all the stuff that we need to put in there. We've got a memo, we've got our price, we know we're within budget. And now I can submit this. Now I've got two. We knew I had $99 available after this one. So now we can go to add our second request. And maybe it's for the same vendor. We'll pretend it's tomorrow. We have whatever attachments we need, EPLS, invoice, whatever it is that supports this. There's that information for me. And let's say this request is $100. If I submitted this request, or anyone who wants to answer in the chat field, will this request be allowed to go through? Well, let's find out. It's allowed to go through. And if I went through and had another one, for $100 again, if I click Show Spend Insight, I've submitted two other requests against my $100 budget. Those two requests totaled $101. But my actual remains at zero. My committed expenditures are at zero. This purchase is $100, so when I'm done, there will be no funds available. So will this request be able to go through? And the answer is yes. And we can continue doing $100 requests all day against this $100 budget. But because these things are not approved, our budget hasn't been affected. And now if we go to approve these, if the $1 one gets approved first, that will go through. The next request, the next two requests would not get approved because they would exceed the budget. Or if we approve one of the $100 ones first, the other two won't be able to be approved. So please keep this in mind when we're doing our requests, that we get that snapshot that tells us what's going to be available, but that's on the assumption that it's getting approved, and the approval has to happen first. And I think I used the same vendor document number. Let me add that field. Yep, I used the same vendor document number twice. So none of these things matter until something gets approved. And especially the vendor document number, that's not going to be seen until this reached Lynette's level. And she tried to approve, she would get the error. Okay, any questions about vendor document numbers or what just happened with the budget or the attachments? Okay. Let's talk about a little bit again about the vendor document and memo fields. So on the top half, we have a screenshot from one of the transactions in Intacct. Highlighted in purple or fuchsia is the vendor document number, account number 17425, December 19 and January 20. On a check stub or an accounts payable, this field becomes bill number. So where the number 2 is. And then where number 3 in fuchsia is what we wrote in the vendor document number ends up on the check stub. And then the same thing for the memo field. We've got that highlighted in yellow. We can see there's 2 entries for the memo field on the Intacct transaction. Memo stays memo on accounts payable and on the check stub. And then here are those 2 lines of entry. And when they're too long, Intacct will shorten them up and put the ellipses in the middle and just randomly choose items from the beginning and items from the end to display. So whatever we have ends up on the check stub. Whatever we enter on the purchasing transaction also shows up on our general ledger the same way. So if we're running a general ledger report and we run it to include the reference number, in the document column, it'll have what we put in our vendor document number. And in the memo description, we can see what's been typed here has ended up in the description on the general ledger. So whenever we use that, it needs to be valuable information, like has been suggested, invoice numbers, account numbers, dates for the memo field, and the same thing in the vendor document number. This would make it easier for anyone to read and know that the person intended to pay account number 17425 for December and January. And if this is for Golden West, so Golden West is probably getting a few dozen checks a month from us. This would also pretty much clearly tell them what account number this payment needs to be applied to, instead of getting 40 checks from the tribe and not knowing whose account it's supposed to go to. What we put on the purchasing transaction request also ends up on our check registers. So here's that vendor document number, and our check register includes that information. And in the memo field, makes it to the check register too. So we have a question, why is it when I process a general ledger, the vendor document info does not show? If we're running a general ledger report, down here where we format, there's these 2 document value columns. If we're going to detail, we can choose one or the other. And if you choose the one that I have selected here, bill/invoice/adjustment number, this would display the vendor document number that's being used. So anything we use in this memo and vendor document number field becomes visible to our vendors and to multiple reports. So as long as we're using good information, this becomes good later on when we're trying to figure out what's happened with a certain thing. All right, so we got some time for a purchasing transaction detail report. And we're going to look We have the first way, if you've never run the report before, we'll go to Reports and Report Center. Easiest thing when we're here, it's the way I use Intacct, and is to make sure all reports is underlined and all applications is selected. A lot of us might have it on favorites and have whatever report we favorited to show up for us, which is great. It's great to use. But if you haven't used Purchasing Transaction Detail Report before, and we land here on favorites, we're not going to find that report. Intacct has a nice little search bar, which allows us to start typing the name of a report. And as we're typing, it's looking for that name. Unlike the vendor thing that we looked at earlier, Intacct will match those words anywhere they're at instead of just reading left to right. So we can just type whatever words we want. And occasionally, someone will ask me, I'm looking for this report, I don't have access to it, or I know I've used it before, why can't I see it? And if we're in the report center, it's usually we've gone to another field other than all reports, and so we don't have it favorited. Or we have one of the applications changed. And you'll see why that's important here in a second. So we'll relook at the search for this report, Purchasing Transaction Detail. And so I have Purchasing Transaction almost completely typed. And what it's brought up is 5 reports that match this combination of words. I'm using all applications, and we can see from the header, all of these reports are located in purchasing. So if none of them are starred, so I don't have them as a favorite. And if I was using financial reports instead of all, for example, I would get a response that there aren't any reports available with that filter. So just be aware of what we have picked up here. For program users, pretty much these last 4 are pretty much not viable fields to be on. We're either going to be on favorites or all reports. I'd say just use all reports. Make sure this has all applications. And then we can find all the reports accessible to us. So if you've never used the report before, this is how we're going to come here and find it. Then we can click on Purchasing Transaction Detail and then start to tell Intacct what we want to see. So this report defaults to this fiscal year. The non-PO voucher I did was way back, I think in 2017. So we're going to look for that one. But we can choose any reporting period we want. It defaults at fiscal current year to date. The default date is today. So it will generate all the transactions from October 1, 2020 through April 9th. So the fiscal year is based on the tribe's fiscal year, October through September. I could change the as of date if I wanted more or less time for this period. So for example, if I wanted this report to end through March, we could type the March 31st date. So now this would be the fiscal year, October 1 through March 31st. Or we can pick from one of the 100 or so different reporting dates that we wanted to see from. If we don't want to use a reporting period in the as of date, and it's just easier for us to punch in a start date and end date, we can do that too. So I've got October 1st, 2016 through today. Whatever we put in these 2 fields overrides this selection up here. They don't work together. It's one or the other, not both. And kind of a nice thing about using these fields is if I left the end date blank, Intacct would just look from everything 10/1/16 through forever basically and return that information to me. And it works the same way. If I left it blank for start date and used today's date, it would look for all the transactions going forward to the very beginning of us using Intacct. So it's a nice, easy way of doing that if we're not sure when the beginning or end period is. So I've got a range of time put in here. I don't remember what the checkbook was on that one. We should have looked at it. Checkbook 12. So I've got a checkbook, I've got a program. This show for all checkbooks, just leave that alone. Always just leave it at what it's at. Funding source ID. If we want to specify a funding source, we can here. Or we leave it blank if we want any funding source that matches this combination of program and checkbook. What is the item ID? You can leave it blank if you're not sure, or you just want all the records to show up for that. Or like in this transaction, item ID is Carnival Ticket 79480. Let's use that. State. We talked a little bit about that in the presentation. We want to bring back anything that's submitted, approved, partially approved, declined, draft, and so on for all the different states. So whatever we select here is going to affect the outcome of our report. You can choose one state or multiple states, or there's a button here to add all if we want all of them. Or if we left this blank, that's choosing all of them also anyway. So if you want to get more specific, by all means, select a state. This is great if we're doing purchase orders. We want to see pending POs. Maybe we would do it that way. Type. What type of purchasing transaction are we researching? We can only pick one type of transaction for this, so I'm picking non-PO voucher. Or you can leave blank if you'd want all purchasing transactions, but we're going to look for just this one. And then vendor, leave it blank or pick a certain vendor. This vendor is vendor V1122. Oops. So now we have all that information there. If you're not sure on state and you don't want to go to ljstraining.info to find that spreadsheet, when you're in Intacct, you can go to Help and Support, go to Help Center. Type purchasing state, and we get a response, purchasing transaction states. And there's a detailed explanation for each one of those states. So often when I get asked questions I don't know the answer to, this is what I do, and then I can answer your question. Same way in Mardis and Workforce Go, they have the same thing available. So here we are. We've got our stuff. We want to give this report a customized title if we want to. If it's for our own purposes, then no, we're ready to view. And voila, here we go. Here's that one transaction I've done as a non-PO voucher. And we see the date it was created, who the program was, the funding source, the checkbook. It's a non-PO voucher, a link to that transaction. So if we didn't know, like we didn't already have this information available to us when we were searching, this link would take us to that non-PO voucher for more information if that's what we were doing, that's what we're looking for. Tells us at state how much it was. Here's the item ID, the vendor. And for like purchase orders and stuff, we can see where it was converted from. If Memo was used, then reference number, here's the vendor document number. And if customer was used, it would give you customer also. So a pretty handy report. From there, we could print it, email it to somebody, or take it out to Excel, Word, CSV, another format, which might be useful if this was like a long list of transactions and maybe we were just printing all purchase orders that were pending. Or specifically someone wanted to know our non-PO vouchers, like our donations for the month of March, that kind of thing. We might be, getting that ready and then exporting it to Excel, or just printing it right to a PDF then. Okay, any questions for the purchasing transaction detail report? Okay, so I don't see any questions coming in through the chat box. This is all the information I wanted to cover today for non-PO vouchers. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me outside of this. I've recorded this thing, so when that's done and available, I'll email this to everyone. And then I'll also send a copy of this PowerPoint presentation. And then I also upload that stuff on the website that I try to maintain. But on that website and the training info page, I haven't emailed users yet, but there's some new training out there. Like on the April 23rd, people should be aware now I'm doing a training on Workforce Go, editing timesheets. But I'm going to do a managing purchase orders training in May, preparing FY22 budget proposals in Martis. And then at the end of May, I'll probably be doing one on the travel request workflow. So those are available now to be signed up for, and I just have to email those out to everybody. All right, well, thank you everyone for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.